As they got close to Milk Creek, the boundary that was generally accepted as the edge of the reservation, Major Thornburg met some civilian teamsters who said they had met with Colorado. The chief told them that if the soldiers crossed the creek, it would lead to war. Thornburg didn't think much of the warning and kept going towards Milk Creek. On September 29, 1879, the same day that the Meeker Massacre happened, a group of 200 Army soldiers under Major Thornburg were marching towards the reservation. When the soldiers were about 17 miles from the Indian Agency, they crossed the reservation border. Suddenly, things got really chaotic. They were attacked and ambushed by a Ute force of about 200 warriors. The soldiers quickly formed a circle with their wagons and sent a messenger to call for help. The battle would go on for a week, making it one of the longest battles in the Old West. It started because the U.S. soldiers had entered Ute territory without permission. Troops, a long and bloody fight in Milk Creek, 17 miles north of Meeker, started the rebellion near the White River Indian Agency. This fight was the result of a series of problems that began a long time before those days when 19 Utes, 24 soldiers, and 11 whites died at Milk Creek and the agency. The Ute people were still following the rules of the Ute Treaty of 1868, which was signed in Washington, D.C. by Ute Chief Ute. This treaty gave the Ute people control over much of western Colorado. However, prospectors, miners, and settlers were moving into Denver and the Colorado mountains to find gold and silver. They were coming from all directions. The 7 Ute bands living in Colorado and Utah thought the new treaty meant the settlers would stay out, not the Utes. But 2 earlier treaties had already taken away more of their land. In 1849, the Utes gave up their land in northern New Mexico, and in 1863, they lost more land east of the Continental Divide. This made it hard for the Utes to keep their land. The Ute people believed the new treaty was meant to keep them safe, not to give away more of their land. But the settlers and miners were still coming, taking over the land that the Utes thought was theirs. The Ute people were angry and frustrated. This anger would eventually lead to a big fight. By 1868, prospectors were demanding more. Ure and other top leaders went back to Washington, D.C. It was there that Ure gave a well-known speech, including this statement. The agreement an Indian makes to a United States treaty is like the agreement a buffalo makes with his hunter when hit by arrows. All he can do is lie down and give up. The 107th meridian, which runs about 10 miles west of Aspen near where Aspen Village is today, was the eastern boundary of the 1868 treaty. This treaty was outlined by the Yampa and White Rivers to the north, the Utah border to the west, and the New Mexico border to the south. This further limited the shrinking piece of Colorado territory left for the Utes, who once roamed the majority of Colorado, Utah, and parts of New Mexico. They also hunted as far as parts of Arizona, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Before that, Ute oral tradition teaches that they lived across northern New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. 1. It was a significant agreement, but it was not the only one. In 1873, the United States government made another treaty with the Utes. This one was made with a different leader, Ute. Ute was a Ute leader who was known for being smart and fair. He negotiated the treaty, which gave the Utes more land, but it also made it clear that the land was not theirs forever. 2. The treaty said that the Utes could use the land for as long as they wanted, but the United States government could take it back if they decided to. This was not fair to the Utes, and it was a big mistake. The Utes had been living on this land for thousands of years, and they had a deep connection to it. They had their own language, their own culture, and their own way of life. 3. The treaty was also unfair because it did not give the Utes any say in how the land would be used. The United States government made all the decisions, and the Utes had to follow. This was a big problem, because the Utes wanted to be able to hunt and gather on the land, but the United States government wanted to use it for other things. 4. The treaty was also a sign of the times. The United States government was expanding its territory, and it was pushing Native American tribes out of their land. This was a big problem, and it would continue for many years. 5. The treaty with the Utes was just one of many made with Native American tribes. There were many other treaties, and they were all similar. The United States government would make a treaty with a tribe, and then it would break it. This was not fair to the tribes, and it was a big mistake. 6. The treaty with the Utes was a turning point for the tribe. It marked the beginning of the end of their way of life. They would continue to fight for their land and their culture, but it would be a long and difficult battle. Nathan Meeker had trouble making his community, Union Colony, work. He started it in 1869 in what is now Greeley, Colorado. He also started a newspaper called Greeley, but this made things worse financially. In 1878, President Rutherford B. Hayes offered Meeker a job as an agent for the White River Indian Agency. This agency was in Ute territory. As an Indian agent, Meeker's job was to represent the U.S. government to Native American tribes. He was like an ambassador, helping the government work with the tribes. Meeker's job also involved controlling trade between the U.S. and the Native communities. He wanted to help the Native Americans adopt American ways of life. Meeker was determined to turn the free-roaming Utes into farmers who belonged to a Christian community. Meeker thought farming was the right way to use the land and that the Native Americans were in the way with their hunting seasons and nomadic lifestyle. Meeker was convinced that farming was the only good use of the land. He believed the Native Americans were an obstacle because they hunted and moved around a lot. Before that, the Utes lived a life where they owned very little, but had a lot of horses and belonged to the land. Meeker thought he could solve the entire Western Native problem by telling the natives about the benefits of owning their own land. In the past, there were many Ute groups made up of family members. Over time, these groups broke down into 7 distinct bands, each with their own leaders. Each band had its own system of chiefs. However, in 1868, the U.S. government made a change and appointed Chief Ute of the Uncompahgre Band as the leader of all Utes. Horse racing was one of the Utes' favorite activities when they weren't hunting. Meeker planned to show them a better way of living by plowing up their racing tracks and grazing land to plant crops. This would be his demonstration of how they could improve their lives. Meeker's job was to act as a representative of the government. One of his main tasks was to give the Utes goods as payment for the reduced access to their ancestral land and hunting grounds. This was agreed upon in the 1868 treaty. It's essential to remember that Meeker was in charge of distributing goods to the Utes as part of this agreement. He tried to convince some Utes to settle down, but most stayed in a nearby camp and didn't want to move. His plan didn't work out, and the Utes started to distrust him even more. He had promised them government supplies if they listened to him, but when they didn't, he said the food was stuck and couldn't be delivered. This made the Utes hunt more instead of farming, which made him unhappy because it was taking time away from farming. Because of this, many Utes who were counting on food got less than they needed when winter came. The main Ute leaders, Quinkent, Nagagat, Canavish, and Calero, knew that the white people were taking over. The elder chief Quinkent lived in a house that Meeker had built for him, while the medicine man Chief Canavish lived in a teepee. Maybe Quinkent had seen too many changes and was more open to new ideas at first. Calero, who had about 200 people following him, and Nagagat's group were harder to convince and decided to camp south of the agency. Calero started to distrust and dislike the settlers after his son was possibly shot by a policeman's helper in August 1878 near what is now Granby, Colorado. The Utes were still allowed to hunt north of their reservation, as the 1868 treaty said, so they went further in search of food and ended up getting into fights with white settlers in the North Park area above what is now Hayden. The settlers blamed them for any crimes, fights, or fires in the very dry summer of 1879. All of this made people across the state believe that the Utes should leave. As buffalo and other animals became scarce because white hunters were selling them to the growing mining camps, the Ute groups relied more and more on food promised by the government, which Meeker gave them if they behaved well. In August 1879, Nagagat, a skilled negotiator, went to Denver to talk to Governor Frederick Pitkin. 1. The Utes' situation was not improving. In the spring of 1880, they were still hungry and struggling. Many Utes had been forced to live on the reservation, but they were not happy about it. They were upset because the government had not kept its promises and the land was not as good as they had been told it would be. Some Utes started to leave the reservation and head back to their old way of life, but this made the government worry that they would cause trouble. 2. The government's worry about the Utes was not without reason. In the summer of 1880, a group of Utes, led by a man named Ute, left the reservation and went on a raid. They attacked a group of settlers and killed several people. This made the government even more determined to move the Utes to a different reservation. The Utes, however, were not willing to go quietly. They believed that the government was not keeping its promises and that they were being treated unfairly. 3. The conflict between the Utes and the government continued throughout the summer of 1880. The Utes were still hungry and struggling, and they were also angry about the way they were being treated. The government, on the other hand, was worried about the Utes' behavior and wanted to find a way to move them to a different reservation. In August 1880, the Utes met with the government to discuss their situation. Both sides presented their arguments, but no agreement was reached. 4. The meeting between the Utes and the government did not end the conflict. In fact, it seemed to make things worse. The Utes were angry about the way they were being treated, and the government was worried about their behavior. The situation continued to deteriorate throughout the fall of 1880. The Utes were still hungry and struggling, and the government was still determined to move them to a different reservation. 5. The conflict between the Utes and the government finally came to a head in September 1880. A group of Utes, led by a man named Ute, attacked a group of settlers and killed several people. This was the final straw for the government, and they decided to take action. In October 1880, the government sent a group of soldiers to the reservation to move the Utes to a different reservation. The Utes, however, were not willing to go quietly. 6. The Utes resisted the government's efforts to move them. They believed that they were being treated unfairly and that the government was not keeping its promises. The conflict between the Utes and the government continued throughout the fall of 1880. The Utes were still hungry and struggling, and the government was still determined to move them to a different reservation. In November 1880, the Utes finally agreed to leave the reservation and move to a different one. 7. The Utes' move to a different reservation was not without its challenges. The new land was not as good as they had been told it would be, and the Utes were still struggling to survive. They were also angry about the way they were being treated, and they believed that the government was not keeping its promises. The conflict between the Utes and the government continued throughout 1881. However, the Utes were eventually able to adapt to their new way of life and find a sense of peace. 8. The Utes' story is a complex and difficult one. They were forced to adapt to a new way of life, and they struggled to survive in a world that was increasingly hostile to them. However, they also showed great resilience and determination. They refused to give up, even in the face of great adversity, and they continued to fight for their rights and their way of life. In the end, the Utes were able to find a sense of peace and belonging in their new home. 9. Today, the Utes continue to live on their reservation in Colorado. They have worked hard to rebuild their community and restore their way of life. They have also formed partnerships with the government and other organizations to ensure their continued survival and well-being. The Ute story is a powerful reminder of the importance of respecting and preserving the rights and traditions of indigenous peoples. 10. The Utes' experience is also a reminder of the importance of learning from the past. The government's treatment of the Utes was a grave mistake, and it had lasting consequences. However, by learning from this experience, we can work towards a more just and equitable future for all people. Word count, 3092. He said to Pitkin that Agent Meeker wasn't doing a good job. When people lie, it gets into the newspapers. The Utes want peace. We don't dig up the ground and ruin the grass. My people hunt to get food. Pitkin, who was known for wanting to move the native people, told Nagaga that everyone has to work, and the Utes, who lived on almost a third of the state, could be wealthy if they worked the land for minerals and farmed. The Utes were one of the first tribes to get horses from the Spanish back in the 1600s. Now Meeker said they had too many, and that wasn't good for farming. This was a big disappointment to the Utes, and they weren't going to agree to it. There were a few things that were more valuable to the natives than horses. Their whole way of life revolved around horses. After a physical argument with Chief Canavish over this issue, Meeker sent a telegram asking for help from the army. Meeker wrote, "I have been attacked by Chief Canavish, and it's not safe for me, my family, or my employees. I need protection right away." Meeker's September 10, 1879, request for protection to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. was sent to the War Department and then to Army General William T. Sherman. He agreed that 3 companies of cavalry with mounted infantry should be sent from Fort Steele to the White River Agency, in case the approaching troops were going to remove them. The Utes were getting ready to defend themselves if the 1868 treaty boundary at Milk Creek was crossed. The Utes found out through their scouts that the U.S. cavalry was mobilizing to the north at Fort Steele near Rawlins. When the contingent of troops started marching towards them, the Utes, many of whom remembered what happened at Sand Creek 15 years earlier, when a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village was destroyed, assumed the worst, and they started preparing for war. At the same time, Meeker stopped working and went home with his family. He had tricked the newspapers by writing false statements, lied to the Utes about their land, said he hadn't asked for soldiers when he really had, and claimed the government agreed with killing extra horses to make room for crops and cows. On September 21, 1879, Major Thomas Tipton Thornburg left his base at Fort Steele near Rawlins with 200 soldiers, a doctor, officers, scouts, more than 300 horses and mules, and 25 wagons manned by teamsters with food for 30 days. Their job was to show the Ute reservation that they meant business and help Meeker if needed. Thornburg had thought of a plan to set up camp on the reservation border and see what was going on once they got there. After finding out that Meeker had asked for soldiers, which really upset the Ute chiefs, Nagagat tried to talk to Meeker, but Meeker wouldn't listen and stayed inside his house. Nagagat and some Ute chiefs Ute men rode to find Thornburg on his way to Milk Creek. The chief first stopped and bought 10,000 rounds of ammunition at Peck's store in Hayden, just in case, and sent it back to the Ute camp with 2 men. From there, as the army crossed the Yampa River, Nagagat found Thornburg's nearby camp. He and Thornburg already knew and trusted each other. They agreed that Thornburg and 5 men would go alone to see Meeker's situation at the agency and decide whether to fight or not. Before the situation got out of hand, if troops went across Milk Creek into the reservation, 2 men named Colaro and Canavish had already gathered about 200 well-armed warriors to hide along the ridges. They were hiding in a place where the narrow trail went through a canyon towards the agency grounds. Meanwhile, a man named Quinkett was staying at the agency with some warriors. Ute women and children were moving to a safer place farther south from the agency. As they got closer to Milk Creek, which was the accepted boundary of the reservation, Thornburg met some civilian teamsters who told him that they had met with a man named Calero. Calero said that if the troops crossed the creek, it would be war. Thornburg ignored the warning and kept going towards Milk Creek. They arrived on September 29, 1879, 17 miles northeast of a place called Meeker. The creek flowed into a deep canyon. It was around midday on September 29 when Thornburg decided to move his camp to a new location. This decision was made because there wasn't enough food and water at the dry Milk Creek for his men. A scouting party had recommended moving to a different area, which was Little Beaver Creek, just inside the reservation. From there, Thornburg planned to go to the agency with 5 men. They would be traveling without their guns, as agreed with Nagagat. Some people thought that Thornburg and Meeker hadn't talked about their plans with Kaloro, which had kept the younger warriors calm along the ridges. As Nagagat came close to meeting Thornburg's group, he saw soldiers moving to a better water source. He wondered if Thornburg had gone back on his agreement. He then rode to the Kaloro's Ridge group and told them not to shoot at the soldiers who had crossed the Mill Creek boundary. He wanted to talk to Thornburg later. At the same time, Lieutenant Samuel A. Cherry had gone around the canyon ridges to check on the defenses. He found Kaloro and many Utes ready to defend the reservation boundary. Cherry quickly told Thornburg about the Ute position. Thornburg ordered the main group of soldiers to go back and set up a defensive circle of wagons near North Meadow by Milk Creek. Cherry waved his hat and yelled to the Utes on the ridge to come down and talk, while Thornburg slowly rode back to the wagons, not wanting to make the Utes shoot. With everyone feeling tense, a first shot was fired and the battle started. The cavalry's scouting group started to fall back after a fight. A group of Utes then moved around behind the cavalrymen and Thornburg, where they started shooting at each other as the main group of soldiers formed a circle around the wagons. The Utes used the high ground to their advantage, trying to get around the cavalry and cut them off from where Lieutenant James Paddock's group was guarding the supply wagons on a small hill above Milk Creek. When they heard the shots, Paddock immediately formed a circle around the wagons with the front facing outwards. A Ute sharpshooter shot Thornburg in the head, and he fell from his horse 500 yards from the defensive circle. The soldiers had formed a circle around the wagons with the front facing outwards, and they arranged their supplies, set up tents to block their enemy's view, and dug trenches while piling up dirt to make a wall around them. This was to prepare for a long battle. A lot of shooting was going on, and both sides were getting hurt. Early in the battle, the Utes set fire to the brush south of the wagons. Before the flames reached them, the soldiers were able to put out the fire. At the north end, Captain Payne used the wind to set fire to the grass outside the enclosure. He wanted to take away the Utes' cover so they couldn't completely surround the barricade. He also wanted to burn the civilian wagons that were 50 yards behind, so the Utes couldn't get their contents. He was successful. The Utes moved into cover on the hill above the road. A mixture of rain and snow was falling, creating a messy mixture of mud, blood, waste, and the smell of bad things, along with the chaos of dying animals. After the soldiers shot and killed the animals, the carcasses were stacked up in the defensive wall, along with the bodies of soldiers wrapped in canvas that were shot by the enemy. Any movement or exposure would be a target for the Ute sharpshooters. Their nighttime trips to retrieve water from Milk Creek, which is about 300 yards away, made the soldiers exposed to ambushes. The battle settled into a stalemate with the U.S. troops in a defensive position and the Utes having the advantage because they were on the surrounding land. As the first hours of battle at Milk Creek unfolded, a Ute messenger rode 17 miles south to the White River Indian Agency to tell Agent Meeker about the situation. The messenger told Chief Quinkin that U.S. troops were coming to arrest the chiefs and had committed an act of war by crossing the Milk Creek boundary. The Utes had believed all along that the troops were going to march south to the agency. Chief Quinkin was angry because the troops had entered the reservation without permission and Agent Meeker had lied about asking for their help. Quinkin ordered Meeker to send a last-minute messenger to ask Major Thornburg to negotiate. People at the agency didn't know that Thornburg had already been killed, and the messenger who was supposed to deliver the news was later killed on his way to Mill Creek. Later that day, a group of about 20 warriors from the battle at Mill Creek arrived at the agency. Some of the young people at the agency joined the warriors and started firing at the workers. Meanwhile, Harry Dresser, who had been sent as a last-minute peace envoy, was on his way to talk to the people in charge at Mill Creek. The workers at the agency fought back, but they were quickly overwhelmed. The women and children ran and hid before the warriors took them captive. Something important happened the first night that changed the way people remembered the battle. A man named Joe Rankin, who was a U.S. Deputy Marshal, Scout, and Guide, left the battle area around midnight on September 30th to go to Rawlins and send a telegram for help. The soldiers were surrounded, and they really needed reinforcements. Rankin was one of 3 men who volunteered to make this risky trip, but he was determined to make it. He rode his horse for 140 miles, and it took him around 25 hours. Finally, he arrived at the telegraph office in Rawlins and sent a message for help to come. There were 2 other rescue riders who encountered Captain Francis Dodge while he was on patrol with 30 Buffalo soldiers, north of Hayden. Dodge then headed south on a 70-mile journey to Milk Creek to help the soldiers who were under attack. The next day, October 1st, they arrived at Milk Creek, riding straight through gunfire and lifting everyone's spirits. The arrival of the new troops boosted the morale of the soldiers who were already there, and they held their ground. Word reached Colonel Wesley Merritt at Fort David A. Russell in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He then asked for backup troops from other bases by train to Rawlins. Meanwhile, he started his own march with the 500 men he had, and they arrived at Milk Creek on October 5th. Just as the army reinforcements were arriving, a Ute messenger from Chief Arie also showed up at the same time. The messenger was carrying a message to stop the fighting. The gunshots suddenly stopped, and the Ute force started to retreat. With the Utes' withdrawal, Merritt moved his troops south on Milk Creek, getting out of range from the Utes' new position. Word count, 169 officers came back and said there were hundreds of Utes and they had a lot of bullets. Merritt thought Ute soldiers were coming from Utah and the southern Utes, but in reality, Chief were kept the southern Utes from coming. Eventually, the Utes left. Captain Payne took charge of Thornburg's troops because he was hurt. The army lost 24 soldiers and 44 were hurt, while 19 Utes were killed and an unknown number were hurt too. 127 horses and 183 mules were also killed. Merritt waited for more orders and kept a big camp, which made the Utes leave and hide in camps to the west and south. After 12 days, they found Meeker and his group dead. Their bodies showed signs of being hurt and mistreated. The women who were taken captive said they were treated well. They were let go after 23 days, when Chief Warray asked for them. Then they changed their story, saying they had been attacked, which added to the negative feelings towards the Utes. In 1880, a few months before he died, the government forced Chief Warray to travel by train to Washington, D.C. There, he met with President Rutherford B. Hayes and signed a document that marked the final time the Utes would give up their land. This meant that all of the northern Utes, including the Uncompahgre and White River groups, were moved together to the Uinta and Ute reservations in northeast Utah. Only a small piece of land in southern Colorado was left for them. Chief Ute died in his home in Colorado before the Utes were forced to move to the reservation. Some Utes, like the Colaros Band, were able to roam freely between the Ute reservations and western Colorado at first, but they were eventually forced onto the reservation in 1887.